Hello and welcome to this Unit 6 video lecture. In this unit, we will be exploring the period in Greek history known as the Pentekontaetia, and this term roughly translates as the 50 years, and it covers the span of time from the 470s into the 430s, and it is during this roughly 50-year period that we will see Athens gain power and prestige that few in the 470s thought possible. We'll look at how the Athenians created an Aegean-wide empire and how they will use that empire to foster a broader-based democracy in Athens itself. And we'll take a look at the pivotal role of this guy here. This is a statue of the great statesman Pericles, who some of you have probably heard of in other history classes. It is Pericles who will guide Athens to this role of prominence and power, and he will tower over any other political figure of his age. Indeed, the Pentecontaetia is often referred to as the age of Pericles because of his crucial role in creating the Athens that you and I know, the Athens of the Parthenon, and of the great cultural milieu that defined that city and laid down the foundation for all of subsequent Western civilization. So Pericles is largely the star of this show. As I mentioned, the Pentekontaetia begins with the Greek victory over the Persians in the second round of the Greco-Persian Wars. The great king Xerxes is sent packing, and what is important about this latter phase of the Greco-Persian Wars is the fact that the Greeks actually go on the offensive. Once the Persian ground force is defeated at Plataea, a Greek naval force will sail to Ionia and destroy and capture a large number of Persian ships at the Battle of Mycale. And Mycale will mark the start of a series of offensives in which it will become the Greek objective to liberate all the cities of Ionia, all those Greek cities that had once paid tribute to the Persians. The plan is to liberate them and give them back their freedom. Now, initially there is some debate as to just how far the Greeks should go, and there is a debate over who should take on the mantle of leadership given this effort to liberate the cities of Ionia. And initially, it is the Spartans, who have always been perceived as the military leaders of the Greek world. And in 478, the Spartan regent Pausanias, who was in command of the overall Greek force at Plataea, he will travel to Ionia and will initially be in charge of the Greek efforts there. However, a trend will emerge when we see these Spartan leaders. Once they are away from the close scrutiny of Sparta, they get a little crazy. They tend to really enjoy the finer things in life, and they also act rather arrogantly towards their fellow Greeks. And we see this with Pausanias, who sets himself up in Byzantium as his primary base, and he is soon accused of arrogant and violent behavior toward both his allies and the local Greek citizens in Ionia. As your Martin text points out, many Greeks were not surprised by this abusive behavior and believed that there would be more of it now that the Spartans were spending long periods away from home on distant military campaigns. What does seem true is that the long years of harshly regimented training often left the Spartan men poorly prepared to operate humanely and diplomatically and effectively once they had been freed from the constraints imposed by their way of life at home, where again they were always under scrutiny by the entire Spartan community. So because of this scandalous behavior, Pausanias was soon recalled to Sparta to face various charges, and this will signal a broader reluctance of the Spartan willingness to assert themselves in this new Ionian theater of operations. The Ionians themselves, fearing that someday the Persians will come back, they want an alliance in place, and they want one with one of the mainland Greek states. And if the Spartans are not going to lead it, then by default that position of leadership will go to the Athenians. And it just so happens that the Athenian representative in Ionia at this time was a very prominent and respected Athenian named Aristides. You may remember Aristides was a political opponent of Themistocles, and Themistocles had orchestrated Aristides' ostracism or exile. Well, during the emergency of 480, when Xerxes' invasion was imminent, all the Athenian exiles were recalled for service, and Aristides came back. And this guy was so well respected, and he spoke and acted so well, that the Ionian city-states really thought that it should be Athens that should lead this alliance, and the Athenians agree. Now, I should mention as a footnote what happens to Themistocles after orchestrating the great victory at Salamis. Themistocles himself will be exiled in the late 470s, and he will actually wind up in the service of King Xerxes as a type of baron in charge of a little slice of Persian territory, and he will live out the rest of his days basically an exile from Athens, the city-state that he had saved. So a sad end to Themistocles, but now Athens is on the road to preeminence in the Aegean, a preeminence that Themistocles helped create. The alliance that Athens will lead, which will ultimately be known historically as the Delian League, is made up of, again, these Ionian city-states. And it will be formed in 477 BCE. And at first it is an entirely voluntary alliance, again, made up of these Ionian city-states who do not want the Persians to come back into their neighborhood. So we'll see that they willingly sign on to this alliance. But over time, the Athenians will recognize that this is a way to establish themselves politically and economically as the dominant power in all of Greece. And the Athenians, unfortunately, will begin to use coercive methods to add and retain member states to this Delian League alliance. So it's called the Delian League, and again, that's a modern historical label applied to this alliance. But it's called the Delian League because of a binding oath that the Greek members swore on the island of Delos, an island sacred to the god Apollo. An oath that they would never allow the Persians to return to the Aegean. Now, Delos, the island, was centrally located and was traditionally a place where all Ionians came to worship and celebrate a major pan-Ionian festival. And we must remember that the Athenians themselves were Ionian. They all spoke that similar Greek dialect, the Ionian dialect. And so, because any military alliance needs money and resources to sustain itself, it is decided that the Delian League treasury site will be on the island of Delos. Now, the Athenians, led by Aristides, Aristides the Just, as he was called, determine the amount of the dues that each member polis has to pay. Now, initially, it is encouraged that the member states commit men and triremes to this naval alliance as a type of dues. For the city-states who don't have any naval assets to contribute, they were allowed to contribute silver to pay all the rowers that will be necessary to maintain this fleet. The contributions of ships and silver provided the League enough resources to muster a fleet of more than 400 warships, quite a substantial military force, and it will be more than enough to keep the Persians at bay. Now, we're going to shift our focus to some internal politics at Athens, and what we see is that with the ostracism of Themistocles, the next prominent Athenian figure to step to the forefront is going to be a guy named Kimon. Kimon was the son of Miltiades. You may remember Miltiades as the victor of Marathon. Well, Miltiades had actually run afoul of the Athenian assembly. He had been fined quite heavily for a failed military expedition that he led, which took place after the Battle of Marathon. So he was fined, and his family is now in heavy debt. Now, Kimon, as the eldest son of Miltiades, is able over time to rebuild the family fortunes, both financially and politically, and by the 470s, he emerges as the leader of a conservative aristocratic faction, and it is this faction that will be responsible ultimately for ostracizing Themistocles. Now, the faction led by Kimon believed that it is the Persians who are the deadliest foe of the Greeks, and therefore Kimon and his group want to keep the foreign policy focus on fighting the Persians. Now, one of the reasons that Kimon and Themistocles had such a political feud was that Themistocles felt that it would be ultimately the Spartans who would present to Athens its greatest challenge for political, military, and economic supremacy in the Greek world. So there is this debate going on amongst the policymakers of Athenian society over who constitutes the greater threat to Athens. Is it the Persians or is it the Spartans? And we're going to see this debate play out over the course of the 50 years known as the Pentekontaetia. Now, Kimon, because he is so focused on fighting Persians, is leading attack after attack on these isolated outposts of Persian power in the Aegean. And one by one, he's capturing them. And finally, Kimon will, in the year 466, lead a naval expedition well beyond the boundary of what constituted Ionia, and he winds up crushing a Persian fleet at the Eurymedon River, which flowed out into the sea. And after this defeat at the Eurymedon River, it becomes evident that the Persians have been decisively knocked out of Ionian affairs. And because military success translates as political success, and Kimon was a very astute politician, he will become the leading political figure in Athens. But a real foreign policy question arises out of the decisive defeat of the Persians. Many Delian League members begin to question the necessity of the League, which for many city-states has become a drain on resources. Well, the Athenians steadfastly resolved to keep the Delian League intact forever, not out of fear of a Persian resurgence, but because the League has been a huge boon to the Athenian economy. And that is because the Athenians have very cleverly told the League members that they no longer have to send men or ships. Instead, they can pay their dues with silver alone, and most League members agree to this because the constant campaigning was taking their men away from their other responsibilities at home. So instead, the Athenians say, give us the cash, we'll build the ships, we'll hire the rowers, and we'll take care of the military side of things. All you guys have to do is basically bankroll us. And of course, this arrangement will make the Athenians much more powerful by comparison with the other Delian League members, whose fleets are allowed to shrink while the Athenian fleet grows ever stronger. Now, there are some rumblings amongst some of the Delian League members that they want out anyway. In 471, the island of Naxos, that you and I have looked at before when we looked at the Ionian Revolt, well, the island of Naxos tries to get out of the Delian League, but the Athenians send a fleet and basically tell the Naxians, you better think again. And so Naxos is forced to stay in the Delian League. Something more serious occurs in the year 464 when the island polis of Thasos wanted to leave the Delian League. And Kimon will actually lead a force, an Athenian force, up north to besiege Thasos. And unfortunately for Kimon, the siege goes on and on and on. It's about a 2-year siege. And the Athenians are getting discouraged, and some of the luster is falling away from Kimon's military reputation. And of course, if he is up north leading the 2-year siege, then he's not handling political affairs in Athens. And this offers an opportunity to his political opponents to begin to organize resistance against him. And an attempt is made to end his political career, but for the time being, Kimon, thanks to his conservative allies, is able to maintain his preeminence. The polis of Thasos eventually does surrender, and Kimon is able to return to Athens and regain his political standing. But a shot has been fired across his bow, and he knows it. Now, it is in the 460s that we do start to see tensions emerge, not just amongst the Athenians themselves, but also between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans were growing concerned at the rise of Athenian power, but those concerns are ameliorated as long as Kimon is the preeminent political figure in Athens. The Spartans are reassured because he is an aristocrat, and he firmly believes in maintaining a cordial relationship between Athens and Sparta. Kimon had even named one of his sons Lacedaemonius, which translates as the Spartan. And so, needless to say, there's a real close relationship between Kimon and the Spartans. But now, with this attempt to end his political career by a group that are historically known as the Radical Democrats, and this is a modern label, they didn't call themselves that, they were led by a guy named Ephialtes, who seems to have been a follower of Themistocles. And Themistocles, of course, was one of the first Athenian politicians to act on behalf of the Thete class. And Ephialtes has a younger protege, this Pericles, who we looked at in the first slide, who will, oddly enough, be from an aristocratic family. Yet he will decide to make common cause with the Radical Democrats and will ultimately rise to great prominence as a leader of that faction. Now, these Radical Democrats, what they wanted was to extend the rights and privileges of democracy to all the socioeconomic classes, especially the Thetes, and they make a concerted effort to strip away the political privileges of the upper classes. For example, they wanted to take away the powers of the Areopagus, which, as you might remember from a previous lecture, was the dominant ruling council in the Athenian government and was largely aristocratic in its composition. The Radical Democrats wanted to strip this council of its powers and reallocate those powers to the assembly and to the law courts, and then make it possible for the Thetes to serve in these newly created offices as jurors in the courts. They also proposed paying Athenian citizens a stipend by the state to participate in public affairs. So the Radical Democrats have quite an agenda that was considered radical, certainly to Kimon and his faction, but for the time being, Kimon is in a powerful position, and Ephialtes and Pericles, they can scheme all they want, but their reforms are likely to go nowhere. Then an opportunity presents itself in 464 BCE when an earthquake at Sparta kills quite a few Spartan homoioi. Remember, the Spartan homoioi, the Spartan warriors, when they weren't deployed on campaign, they tended to live together in barracks, and evidently this earthquake caused a number of buildings to collapse, killing large numbers of Spartan warriors. And the Helots, who are waiting for any opportunity to revolt, seize this opportunity, and a very serious Helot uprising threatens the overall stability and survival of the Spartan state. The situation is so serious that the Spartans ultimately ask Athens for aid, and under the terms of the agreement that was signed back during the formation of the Hellenic League in 481, the Athenians were required to respond to any member state who requested help. Kimon brings this issue to the Athenian assembly and basically argues that Athens is obligated to help Sparta in its time of need. And there is a bitter debate because Ephialtes and Pericles and the radical Democrats want nothing to do with helping Sparta. They look upon the Spartans as a regressive society, but Kimon is able to get the Athenians to agree to send a force of about 4,000 hoplites. This force Kimon will lead into the Peloponnese to help stabilize the military situation for the Spartans. Now, we need to note that the 4,000 hoplites leaving Athens presents an opportunity for the radical Democrats to force through some measures that could politically hurt Kimon. That opportunity is actually made even better when Kimon and his Athenian force arrives in the Peloponnese, and the Spartans, shortly afterward, tell the Athenians to go home, in part because the Spartans were worried that the Athenians would actually wind up siding with the Helots, supporting them. And this gives us a sense of just how much distrust there was between Sparta and Athens by the mid-460s. So the Athenians are sent packing, and this is a huge slap in the face to Kimon and his policy of having a close relationship with Sparta. And this opens up another opportunity for the radical Democrats to point at Kimon and his failed Spartan policy and say, you see, Kimon's judgment is no good. He doesn't have Athens' best interest at heart. He's too close to the Spartans. And so ultimately, Kimon is ostracized in 462 BCE. And with Kimon out of the way, the radical Democrats are able to strip away the powers of the Areopagus, that aristocratic council that held a great deal of power in the Athenian government, and those powers were then redistributed to the assembly and to other political outlets. This sets off quite an angry response from the conservatives, and Ephialtes himself is assassinated in 462 BCE. And this, of course, will pave the way for the rise of Pericles, who was Ephialtes' young protege. Indeed, with these events now taking place, we see the likelihood that the relationship between Sparta and Athens is going to deteriorate further, and of course, Pericles may have a role in this deterioration. In the next lecture, we will see the two sides engage in a conflict historically known as the First Peloponnesian War. And that's not to be confused with the Great Peloponnesian War that we will explore in Units 7 and 8. But this gives us a sense of just how frosty the relationship was at this moment between Athens and Sparta by 461 BCE.